to run a fairly standard debate here, and it's going to be fairly structured because we want to go give each debater a chance to express his views clearly, and then we also want to give you folks a chance to ask questions and get involved. So we're going to start off basically with a presentation rebuttal format. First speaker is going to get 30 minutes to present his case. Then there will be a rebuttal by the other speaker, and then that second speaker will make his presentation, rebuttal by the first speaker. That's 70 minutes into the evening, by the way, just if you're keeping score. And then there'll be a question and answer between the two debaters, should they have any questions of each other. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will entertain questions from the audience. We're going to do that in a written question format. So I'm hoping that you all got, or some of you got, the question cards. It's just a little card that you can write a quick question on. And I'll be asking the debaters to keep their answers short to those so that we can get through as many questions as we can. We can be here till 10:30, which is decidedly past my bedtime. But I'm from Elmira. What can I say? Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two debaters. I'm going to introduce them in the order of speaking, just so that we can reduce confusion on my part, if nothing else. Michael Sizer-Watt. Michael asserts that ethics are rooted in objective principles rather than any concept of any deities. He will present a case for the multiple components that comprise the system of our moral sense, as well as recommendations for justifying our moral convictions without appealing to religious dogma. Mariana Grunbank will argue that God is a source of morality, while materialistic concepts lack the ability to account for moral values, duties, and accountability. So, without any further having to suffer listening to me, Michael, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Good evening. Okay, so I don't know if you all were made aware. It will be presupposed that I'm an atheist. I assume God does not exist. And then for Mario's portion of his debate, he will obviously assume that God does. Okay, so it won't be a debate over whether or not God exists. That being said, I'm going to talk tonight not about maybe what you might have been expecting. Normally when people debate over is God involved in morality or what is morality, it usually, especially when it's over whether or not God's involved, usually things are brought up like the Euthyphro argument, which is a Plato dialogue that many of you probably have heard of. I'm going to stay away from the philosophy tonight as best I can, and I'm going to refer more to empirical evidence for my claims. And the reason is because it's very interesting. We're at a time right now, starting in around 2000, where people, particularly psychologists, social psychologists, and people who have access to tools that allow them to do scanning of the brain and things like that, are able to make observations that great minds in the past who were fantastic people at theorizing about morality just didn't have access to. So they had great abilities to speculate, but a lot of it was very subjective. A lot of the theory they came up with, they just didn't have any data to go on except for their own subjective experience. So I'm going to argue that morality is purely a natural phenomenon, okay? It's a phenomenon that takes place in all social animals. It's not a human unique capacity, although it does vary between different species. Human morality is obviously more complex than, say, canine morality, but it exists in all social animals. And then that'll take up most of my presentation, and then I'll switch gears a little bit toward the end to keep it, I think, to make it a little more valuable, rather than just spend the whole time talking about a description of what morality literally is. I will also offer a prescription of what I think some people, or certainly myself up until more recently, struggle with as far as, well, how do I justify? If I don't believe in a third-party lawmaker, then how do I say to someone, this is what I believe and I feel I'm okay to believe that and I feel it's right? So, that being the case, so morality is a natural socio-biological phenomenon, okay? Like all things, I mean, like all other creatures, we evolved from previous forms, and physical traits as well as behavioral traits develop throughout the development of a species. And because I'll use the word highly, but maybe a better way to say it is relatively complex cognitively compared to other animals, our moral sense tends to be a lot more elaborate than, say, in chimps, for example, or dolphins or elephants. So a question that particularly secular people, if you admit to someone that you don't believe in God, a common question that you're asked is, well, if you don't believe in God, where do you get your morals? Okay, and I think generally when an atheist hears this question, it's, oh, here we go again, great. But I think the frustration lies in a couple of areas. Initially, the frustration might be that, oh yeah, now I'm going to have to listen to, if you don't believe in God, you can't be moral, which I think is partially valid. But I think there's a further frustration for the atheist when it comes to this question, because I don't know that it's so easy to actually answer the question, right? You might think to yourself, well, no, I don't believe in God. Yes, I do believe I'm a good person, but I don't know how to prove it, you know, other than through my actions. I mean, people tend to think I'm an okay guy, but how do I justify that, you know, express it? So when someone asks you, if you don't believe in God, how do you justify your morality, or where do you get your morality? I think we need to analyze the question in two ways. Because from a literal sense, the question is actually asking, if you look at it just literally, where do you get your morality, is asking the question, what's the origin of your morality, which I'm going to address for most of my presentation. But I think generally when the question is asked, what they mean to ask is, how do you justify your moral convictions? Okay, and again, that's, as I said, that'll be the last part where we'll talk about objectivity, and how is it that a person who doesn't appeal to a third-party lawgiver make any claims that you're not just being subjective, and you're not just saying what you think and with no justification. So traditionally, moral theory, traditionally from a secular perspective, if we ignore divine command theory and ignore natural law for now, from a secular perspective, there have generally been two camps of moral theory. And essentially, the figures that are mostly regarded as the heads of these two different camps would be a Scottish philosopher from the 1800s named David Hume. And one of Hume's most famous sayings, he was a genius, incredible. He was, by the age of 25, he had written the history of England. Anyway, to keep on the topic, one of the things that's, that he's credited as saying is, we are slaves to our passions. And so Hume believed that because we are emotional creatures, because we have emotions, like many other creatures, we are compelled to be moral beings. In other words, his example would be, you know, if I witness someone suffering, I can't help but feel the pain as well, to some degree at least. Therefore, I am compelled to be to be altruistic, to try to avoid causing harm, or to, you know, alleviate harm wherever possible. Around the same time, roughly, somewhere in the late 1700s, Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, would disagree. He said, no, emotions only get in the way. Emotions cause biases. In fact, the only reason we're moral beings is because we have the capacity to reason. We have the ability to look at a situation and apply logic. We can think critically and say, well, you know, my emotions tell me I should do this, but because I can, you know, I can do a cost-benefit analysis, and I can say, well, you know, if I do this, it'll hurt one person, which is bad, but it'll save 50, so even though I don't feel good about it, I know that I should do this. So Kant said, emotions only cloud our moral objectivity, and that only through reason can we be objectively moral.